You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. My guest today is Andrew T. Walker, who is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. An Associate Dean in the School of Theology, he is also the Executive Director of the Carl F. H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement. His new book is entitled Liberty for All, Defending Everyone's Religious Freedom in a Pluralistic Age, which is the topic of our discussion today. Professor Walker, welcome to Talking Freely.
Rowan, it's nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
The subtitle of your book indicates that religious freedom is not just for Christians or the religious, but even for those who don't think they need it or would benefit from it. Why is it important for everyone, as you suggest?
So when we think about religious liberty, we need to understand it as a baseline principle that society needs to organize itself around, because if you don't have a basic assumption of equality under the law, the human temptation is to then begin applying criteria for a person or an institution or a religion's place in society. So you can think about this not only in the context of, in more Western societies, of Christian, Muslim, Jewish, for example, but I mean, even go back to earlier periods in history, what we might call a more Christendom model is if you don't have a baseline protection for religious liberty, you had Protestants versus Catholics, you have Protestants versus Protestants, and so there's these never-ending rush to want to see your tribe or your viewpoint as the viewpoint that's in charge and as the viewpoint that's able to wield authority on what is a valid basis for membership in a society. And so I think there's a political, philosophical aspect of this, just that teaches us, unless we're all treated equally under the law, the aspect of human nature is to aggregate power unto itself, and then to make divisions in society based on those classifications. But from a theological perspective, and I should acknowledge, I'm approaching this question as a confessionally Orthodox Baptist and Protestant Evangelical. When you look at Scripture, the foundations for society and social order, legitimacy is not tied to a nation state having total and complete religious consensus. I go back and ground this in what we call the Noahic covenant, and I want to acknowledge I'm borrowing off the work of great scholars like David Van Drunen and Jonathan Leeman, who have made these arguments before me, that when God reconstitutes the social order in the Noahic covenant, the basic essentials for society to perpetuate itself is a basic sense of industry, family life, and justice. And so participation in the social order and a reconstituted Noahic covenantal context is not dependent on a society having complete religious homogeneity. And then even when you get to the New Testament, you go to a place like Romans chapter 13, Paul is able to make an argument about the role of the state in bearing the sword, but then assigning the bearing of the sword not within the purview of the magistrate or the governing authority, having complete and total perfect access and correct access to divine revelation, and the understanding that only, for example, Christian magistrates are legitimate magistrates. When we make those types of propositions, what we end up saying is that government is legitimate insofar that it's Christian, and that the social order itself is legitimate in only insofar as it is Christian. So I just don't see that argument from the Old Testament or the New Testament, for that matter. Now, it's also worth stating, though, that to say that a social order does not hinge upon the social order having a complete homogeneous understanding of religion, it doesn't mean that society can just perpetuate itself without the possibility of error and disaster and injustice resulting. When societies jettison the natural law, when they jettison basic standards of justice, when the centrality of the family is eclipsed, when one's participation in the cultural order is understood to be static rather than dynamic, you're going to have social orders decay. And that's one of the things I want to bring to this conversation around religious liberty, is this nature of paradox. The human temptation is to say it's all or nothing in terms of how political communities govern themselves. But what I want to argue about, especially in the title of the book, is in a pluralistic age. Central to my thesis is an understanding that we are living in a time in between the times, so to speak. So in a Christian anthropological framework, we're understanding that Christ has come on the earth, but his kingdom has not come in full. And so Christians obviously have this sense of anticipation built into their DNA, that we think at the end of history, Christ will come back and he will judge, and he will bring all erring religion and ideology to heel, and he will judge that. But that's his doing, not ours. And so if we're living in this, what I want to call secular age, where the power of the sword, or the power of the church has not been given to the power of the state to wield, what are we to do with people who don't think like you or I? How do we understand the nature of difference? And that's one of the core arguments of my book, is one of the reasons we should embrace religious liberty is it simply recognizes the fact of our age, that there is deep divergence on a lot of ultimate matters, but there can be what I want to call penultimate convergence. And there can be just ordering of societies, and pagans and non-Christians can rule justly. And I think that accords with what we see as present both in the Old Testament, in the Noahic covenant, and in the New Testament and the New Covenant.
In your book, you evoke the theologian Carl Henry, who refers to the divine standards by which man and society must conform if civilization is to endure. What are the limits of these bedrock standards that still allow for competing social imaginaries?
That's a good question. So I'll come back to what I said a few minutes ago in my initial response, is where you have societies that are perpetuating injustice, societies that are failing to recognize basic moral minimums, such as the dignity of the unborn, for example, where you have societies that are unable to identify what a man or what a woman is, where you have societies that have redefined the family, my understanding, we are slowly casting off those constraints that are that they're, in my view, in the fullness of history, ultimately Christian realities, because I believe in creation order. But we have to understand that the nature of creation theology, as we look at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and then as it's reaffirmed in Genesis chapter 9 in the Noahic covenant, is that these ultimate Christian realities are not exclusive Christian realities in this age. And so all societies are called to pursue justice. All societies are called to understand the truth of what male and female identity are. They're called to recognize what the nature of family life is. They're called to recognize the goodness of productivity, of industry, of not being idle, of participating in the cultural mandate. And where societies fail to recognize these moral minimums, I do sense that society is endangered. And it's interesting, I wrote this book making this argument that I stand by, while at the same time making the argument that I can test the durability of my thesis based on how societies are doing in recognizing these basic moral minimums. And I would not give, especially the West, high marks on these issues. And that gets to one of the arguments I do make in the book is the limits to religious liberty in a secular age is when you have religions or ideologies who view themselves as essentially bestowers of utopia and bestowers of utopia that can be enacted in this present age. And where you have societies that believe that they can enact paradise or utopia through either immanentized religion or through secular understandings of the good, you are creating systems that are going to be inhospitable to religious liberty in the long run. If you don't have an account of how to protect those who disagree with you, when those who disagree with you are an impediment to your understanding of the common good and the totalized vision for society, you are endangering religious liberty. So the threat to religious liberty can come both from failing to adhere to basic moral minimums. It can also come from absolutizing and immanentizing one's religion and one's ideology in the present as well.
Another reference you make to Carl Henry quotes him saying, "It is not the role of government to judge between rival systems of metaphysics." Does that mean that governments and courts can see religion as merely one more vision of meaning among infinite visions of human flourishing?
What I think Dr. Henry meant in that quote is, it's easy to read that quote and think that he is calling for governmental skepticism about the true, the good, and the beautiful. I don't think that's what he's getting at. I think what he's saying is it is that conceptions of the true, the good, and the beautiful can be obtained on the basis of general revelation, natural law, what Henry would refer to as a creation ethic. You have to understand that Henry himself was a Baptist, and so he was very much concerned with not linking institutionally the jurisdictions of the church and the state. But he would also say that the state cannot be agnostic on principles related to the Ten Commandments. And also in the book, I cite Dr. Henry as stating that the government does need on the back end of its understanding of its moral duty to enforce more or less the last 5 commands of the Ten Commandments that relate to man's duty to man. But those, according to Henry, so the Ten Commandments, the Christian moral tradition would say, are rooted in natural law. They're rooted in the structures and orders of creation. And one need not possess religious homogeneity to obtain those basic moral minimums. I don't think one needs to be a Christian to understand that murder and theft and protecting the relationship between the family or the parent and the child are worthwhile protecting. And so that is part of the paradox of a Baptist vision for church and state. It's to simultaneously say it's not the job of the church and the state to commingle with each other institutionally, but politics does need religion because religion offers kind of the first pre-political seedbeds for how we understand morality and virtue. I'm not calling for materialism. I'm not calling for the state to be committed to a secular progressive understanding of itself. And especially in an American context where I'm coming from, uh, we do not elect people to be priests who serve in government, but we also don't elect them to be amoral automatons or robots. We elect people who are supposed to represent us and represent our communities and represent the deeply held social commitments and agreements that those communities hold, which they then elect people to represent them on behalf of. That's one of the real misunderstandings, I think, of what it means to be uh, participating in a representative democracy. To say that it is legitimate for there to be Christian legislators who have had their consciences formed by the Christian moral tradition is not to say that when a legislator passes a law on the basis of their understanding of what justice is, according to the Christian natural law tradition, that's off limits or that's a violation of church and state. We have to have a moral discourse that allows us to engage in meaningful moral discourse. And what I'm calling for in the book is to understand that's going to happen more on those outer limit issues. I mean, so we have to have a society where at its most basic level, it affirms the commitment to human dignity and to the protection of human life. And where societies fail to recognize and appreciate that, it does test the limits, so to speak. But you know, we have in the West laws that prohibit murder. When we talk about prohibiting murder, we as a nation are able to reason to those prohibitions without the government adopting a Christian ethic. Now, on the one hand, someone could push back and say, yeah, but in the West, we also have very permissive abortion laws. But I would say that the debate in a Western context regarding abortion is not over whether murder is permissible. I think everyone would say that murder is wrong, and they surely should say that murder is wrong. I think the debate over abortion is a matter of personhood and how far should the law extend our understanding of personhood. I don't think the debate is over whether or not murder in itself is right or wrong.
In our time, the notion of a non coercive organization of the state seems to be suffering under a more persuasive standard of harm minimization. What insight can you offer about how religious people can credibly endorse pluralism where it's called out for indirectly harming others?
That's a good question. And especially in Western contexts, these issues of dignitary harm are being raised all the time to essentially bar what I would call traditional Christian understandings of sexuality and gender from having their place in society, having equal place in society along more expansive and progressive understandings of sexuality and gender. What I would want to say to that question is before we get to questions of what is or is not harmful, we need to ask a question of what is necessarily true. If we're answering questions solely on the basis of utilitarian consequence, we're bypassing the most important question that should be at the heart of our public policy is what is true, what is principled, what is reasonable, what produces human flourishing. And I can totally understand why someone perhaps on the left would want to accuse Christianity of engaging in these types of dignitary harms because we're not affirming on matters of sexuality and gender. But I think that raises a question. is the harm that individuals feel that they are experiencing, is that the result of Christian teaching being wrong, or is that the result of something intrinsic to the very nature of sexual identity and gender identity being problematic? And so again, that comes back to an issue of human flourishing, of what is true and what is reasonable. And I would simply say, if we as a civilization are willing to say that the relationship between male and female is the governing principle for the human sexes, and if we're willing to cast off the idea that gender is integrally tied to our biological sex, if we're willing to say that those ideas are unreasonable, are untruthful, I think it's absolutely brazen and arrogant to say that this roughly radically 30 or 40-year experiment we're having in the West around matters of gender and sexuality have all of the authority unto themselves to make that declaration. We are engaging in society in what C.S. Lewis refers to as chronological snobbery. It's the idea that what we believe in this moment at this time is the most correct understanding that human history can possess because we are simply at that moment in time. That's chronological snobbery. And what it does is it discards the inheritance and the traditions and the legacies that have been passed down to us. And please, let me emphasize, what Christians understand about gender and sexuality is not different than what Muslim and Jewish individuals believe about matters of gender and sexuality. Because what I think that teaches is that these aspects of our personhood are tied to our nature. They're tied to our nature, bound up in the very essence and fabric of creation itself, which kind of comes full circle with what I've been talking about with natural law, with various traditions, all across human history, across all different types of geographies and cultures and eras, understanding these basic truths of human organization and human identity. And so we're willing to say, and audaciously say, all of human history has been wrong. And we are the ones we've been waiting for in terms of our enlightened understandings of gender and sexuality. When in reality, this is a revolutionary experiment that bypasses the central question of what is true, what is good, what produces human flourishing for the sake of the common good. And I'm not convinced, and I have dedicated my ministry thus far to upholding the reasonability and the defensibility of the Christian sexual ethic. Not only because I believe it as a Christian, but because I believe that it is bound up in the very fabric and order of creation itself. That all people, again, trans historically and trans geographically, have the ability to recognize when they're utilizing reason properly.
A contentious piece of legislation in America right now that relates to this is the Equality Act, which is being accused of ignoring religious freedom protections. What is the threat that this act poses, and what in particular has led the Biden administration to disregard First Amendment guarantees of religious freedom?
The Equality Act is a piece of legislation that would seek to insert the categories of gender identity and sexual orientation into all aspects of civil rights law and non-discrimination law. What the Equality Act fundamentally does is it takes away viewpoint neutrality around matters of sexuality and gender. And it says, if you disagree with the government's understanding of sexuality and gender, you're now on the wrong side of the law. And if you're on the wrong side of the law, over time, the law is going to come for you because the nature of law is prohibitive. Law is pedagogical, it's teaching. There are coercive elements to the law. There is the idea that the law communicates norms and expectations and around belief and around our conduct. And that's my primary concern around the Equality Act, is that it fundamentally transforms the moral imagination and the social imaginary around sexuality and gender, and it fundamentally displaces a Christian natural law understanding of gender and sexuality with a wholly secularized understanding of these issues. And so what it does in time is to say, if your institution and your convictions are not up to snuff with what the government believes, we can come after you. And not only that, the brazen aspect of the Equality Act is one of its provision specifically nullifies the ability for people to appeal to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a piece of legislation that was passed in 1993 that is a recourse that religious citizens can appeal to whenever they feel that their religious freedom is being infringed upon. And so not only does the Equality Act say, this is what the government believes about matters of sexual orientation and gender identity, so little can you disagree with this that we're not even giving you the recourse to appeal to the government to make a claim of disagreement on the very foundation that someone would find themselves wanting to appeal to, which is on the basis of their religion. So the Equality Act, it has to be understood as I wrote an article at the American Conservative on this issue, and I called it Farewell to a Christian Metaphysic. The Equality Act signals the final death rattle, so to speak, of the Christian understanding of family life, of the person, of how sexuality should be channeled.
Something that's causing rifts within the church here and in the United States are the so-called culture wars. You quote Jim Spivey, who says that true religion separates itself from worldly power. Could you take us through some examples of these culture wars and how Christians can identify the difference between fighting them and dutifully being salt and light in politics and the institutions?
That's a good question and a hard question, because what I notice happening in this type of conversation is someone can have the best of intentions of not seeing themselves as a culture warrior, but because by nature, when one engages in these conversations, they are accused of participating in a culture war. So that's the hard part, is no matter how these issues come up, the way that the media in the West handles them is, if you don't agree with kind of the officially accepted narrative, you are engaging in culture war, even if you, as the Christian, don't see yourself as trying to, for example, take America back for God. I think this all, it has a degree to do with the way that you hold your convictions. It has to do with the question of what are your goal or objectives in how you hold your convictions. Is the goal of your convictions to see them universally reflected in law for the sake of the common good for all people? Or is your understanding of sexuality and gender meant to essentially serve and prop up Christianity as the reigning social order, or the reigning social vision for society? Now, all societies have to have reigning social visions for them to be coherent. What I'm calling for in this book is absolute engagement with the culture, with politics, but to root our understanding of the common good and a social vision, not solely for the sake of Christian empowerment, but understanding that what we believe is good for all around what it means to be human and on matters of gender and sexuality. And so, I don't see myself individually engaging in the culture war, but I am certain that critics of my work and would accuse me of being a culture warrior, even though that's not how I see my own motive of operation in this conversation. So I think for us to have a conversation about the culture war, it's It's to ask, what are your intentions? What are your goals? And to also recognize that the culture war accusation is only typically thrown around at conservatives. The culture war aggressors are progressives. They're the ones that are seeking to belittle and intimidate and bring Christianity to heel on matters of the sexual revolution. And whenever Christians find themselves being able to say no, all of a sudden you're accused of being a culture warrior. And so often, what is accused of being culture war is little else than Christians just bearing faithful witness to being exactly what you said in your question, to being salt and light. So I want to vote my values. I want to debate my values. I'm willing to have protracted, serious disagreement with people on these matters. My question is, who is the one being the aggressor? To be the aggressor means you're being the one who is accusing a certain viewpoint of wanting to do harm to one group for the sake of another. Well, that's not my intention at all. I want to do harm to nobody. I want all people to flourish. I want all people to know and experience the very best this world has to offer. I want the common good to flourish for all persons. And we have to be able to do that through reasoned discourse, not simply defaulting to unhelpful language and accusations that come with culture war type rhetoric.
Just to explore that question a little more, you describe secularism as that which desacralizes the temptation to fuse the religious and the political. This error is commonly seen as the culprit in the Trumpist evangelical movement, which, quote, immanentizes the eschaton. Can you explain this and how it also occurs in more subtle ways in how we engage culture?
Great question. When I talk about desacralizing politics, that's not a call to disengage from politics. It's rather to shift our perspective on what the very nature of politics is about. The nature of politics ought not to be pertaining to matters of ultimacy. Politics is about matters of penultimacy. Politics is about figuring out prudential arrangements of the common good that allow all people to flourish in a diverse society, which necessarily means compromise. It means a lack of perfection, and it means being unable to enact your totalized vision for society. It means that there are always going to be people who disagree with me, and I can't just claim the mantle of power and vanquish my foes, that I have to figure out a way to peaceably coexist alongside people who disagree with me. And so when we ascribe ultimacy to politics, what we're trying to do is subtly enact religion for the sake of the polis, and to make the polis a mediator of the divine. And I'm following a pretty standard Reformed two kingdoms understanding here. That's not the role of the state. The state is to adjudicate matters of basic justice pertaining to what affairs are necessary for the just ordering of society in this age.
A line from your book says, when political orders thwart God's design by exceeding their just authority, expect politics to take on a religious-like fervor. Can you elaborate on this idea of a universal proclivity to worship?
So when we talk about a universal proclivity to worship, I'm taking here my cues from Genesis chapter 1, the fact that we have been created in the image of God. And so that sends the signal to me that humanity has a unique composition in terms of its relationship to the rest of creation. And its unique composition makes it relatable and representative to God in ways that the rest of creation does not. And to be made in God's image is to understand that we have faculties of comprehension, and fundamentally, that because we have faculties of comprehension, individuals are what I want to call meaning-making agents. That inherent to our nature is the desire to understand what is true and good and beautiful, and to understand that in a fallen society, we don't stay in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We have to go to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 is where the whole story of pluralism begins, because we're understanding that because of sin, people are not in relationship to God as they ought to be. If they're not in relationship to God as they ought to be, that's inviting fragmentation. It's inviting disarray into the narrative. But just because there's fragmentation and disarray, it doesn't eradicate all aspects of what it means to be made in God's image, that certain elements still retain to fallen image bearers, and aspects such as agency, our conscience, the desire to live authentically, the desire to constitute ourselves according to what we understand and grasp as deep ultimate truth. Those things still cohere, and even in fallen agents. And so I have to have an account for humans, even in a sinful fallen state, are going to make meaning for themselves. It's a question for political societies and deliberative governmental bodies to ask themselves, as these individual agents have differing accounts of meaning, how much liberty can we grant them in the public space before we have to step in and curtail their actions? I don't think beliefs can necessarily ever be curtailed, because beliefs exist inside the mind, but we know that beliefs inform our ethics, which obviously informs how we conduct ourselves. And so it's totally within the purview for governments to find what are those limits that people can engage in religious conduct without those posing threats to the common good. And we have those limits pretty well established when there's matters of public safety and public health involved. I do believe government has legitimate interests in stepping in and curtailing some aspects of religious agency. In an American context, we have what I mentioned earlier, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which has a couple interesting little tests inside of its legislation that says the government has to have a compelling governmental interest to restrict your religious liberty. And when it does want to restrict your religious liberty, it has to do so using the least restrictive means possible. So it means it can't be overly burdensome in restricting your religious liberty. In fact, it has to find the least restrictive way to burden your liberty, because in an American context, and I think this is absolutely correct, in an American context, it's the burden of proof is not on the religious persons. It's not their responsibility to prove to the government the nature of their religiosity. It's the burden of government to prove when it can step in and restrict someone's religious liberty. And where that default lies is really, really important. And we have the default of liberty resting on our shoulders as human agents. And it's the default and the burden of government to prove when they should restrict someone's religious liberty. And I think that's a healthy construct, because it's recognizing the nature of the variegated nature of human personality and creating all different types of meaning. And please hear me, there's a temptation to be misunderstood here, to say that because we're meaning making agents, that all understandings of meaning are equal. That's not what I mean at all. What I'm simply trying to argue for is, in a society of difference, we have to allow for people to be wrong in order for them to come to a knowledge of the truth themselves. And so this is not to protect relativism. It's not to say that all views are necessarily equal. It's simply to say that the government is going to give you liberty up until it has to restrict your liberty.
Turning to religious liberty as Christian mission, and quoting again from your book, Christian advocacy for religious liberty in a society is not pursued primarily to shore up or preserve the reigning political order. It is not pursued under the auspices of rights, as important as rights are. Religious liberty must be imbued with theological gravitas. How is religious liberty to be understood beyond socio-political concerns and beyond the successful prosecution in our skeptical secular culture?
This comes back to understanding that religious liberty exists on two domains. It exists as an issue of political order, which I think, again, that's a penultimate reality. What I'm calling for Christians with this book is for us to understand the theological significance of religious liberty for the sake of political order. But fundamentally, as it relates to mission, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, aspects of religious liberty go into our understanding of mission all the time. So from our ability to engage in evangelism, for people to make free proclamation of the gospel, and then for people to make free responses to the gospel, okay, that's a matter of religious liberty. So mission is implicated in that. But then also, when you think about the nature of Christians bringing their witness into the public square, the ability to make public arguments from a religious viewpoint, that presumes on a constitutional and cultural political milieu that is allowing those types of arguments to be made. I relate this to the ways in which you have, especially in American context, a rich tradition of Christian social agencies and advocacy organizations who are trying to lobby for human flourishing in Washington and all over the United States. And to do that, to have the freedoms to try to bring about justice, that presumes a horizon and context where you're able to do so. And so all of a sudden, that is concerning religious liberty, and it implicates the mission of what we're trying to accomplish. Now, obviously, the mission of Christ and the mission of the church is going to go forward regardless of the context. I believe in the sovereignty of God's kingdom. But I also, at the same time, don't want to put up roadblocks legally that make it more difficult for the mission of the church to go forward. In a Western context, there's almost this martyr complex where we're lusting for martyr-like status, that we valorize the early church for its smallness and for its faithfulness and for it existing on the margins. And I don't know necessarily why we want to valorize that, because the early church faced stiff difficulties that I think if the early church could ask, would you rather have freedom or restrictions, they would probably want freedom. If you ask the underground church in China, would you rather be able to meet freely and in the open, or would you rather have to keep your Christian identity private? And so all of these things matter, and they add up in the aggregate to creating an ecosystem of religious liberty that is either favorable to the mission of the church or unfavorable to the mission of the church, while recognizing that God acts how he is going to act in history, regardless of the particular socio-political context that the church finds itself in.
You quote Levi Strauss, who refers to just order as reconciling non-oppressive order with freedom, which is not license. How do you anticipate the deterioration of these things in the West, particularly if religious freedom is gradually excluded?
This is the grand paradox of how to govern in an age where people can be given liberty, but then not use their liberty to exploit the very nature of political order itself. And one of the goals of this book was for us to obtain a better understanding of what liberty is. Liberty, contrary to popular understandings, is not the freedom to do what one wants. That's a cheapened form of liberty. True liberty is the ability to do what one ought. And so to say that to do what one ought, that assumes a telos. It assumes a right pathway of action. So the job of the government is to produce this context of liberty that allows for people to live out the truth, to pursue the good. Religious liberty and basic liberty simply says, okay, well, to protect people's ability to live truthfully and to experience the truth, we also are going to have to make room for people to make mistakes about their understanding of the truth as well. And so, I mean, I can't answer your question perfectly. It's simply a matter of how far can we go as a society to test the very limits of the constraints that God has placed on creation and still exist as a society. And I write in the book, while I believe that religious liberty can exist in non-Christian societies, I believe that it's a challenge for it to exist in non-Christian societies, because there are elements to the Christian moral tradition that are absolutely vital to understanding what religious liberty is and why it matters, not only for Christians, but for the broader commonplace as well. And so the secularist concern is a valid one. And again, I know I just said this, but I do raise serious concerns about the tenability of religious liberty persisting when you have an increasingly secular vision of society that does not account for religion. And then, as we've discussed already, that views certain tenets of those religions as engaging in harm. So I think what we have to do in response to that is, if I can pat myself on the back here, is to do what I've done, is to write the books, is to make the arguments, to advance our position, to contend for what we believe is true and good and beautiful, and to keep pushing for the arguments that are hospitable to religious liberty. And that obviously includes engaging in acts of politics. It means instilling the right legislators and judges that will hold to these truths. But it also means communicating what religious liberty is and rescuing it from its kind of culture despisers as well. One of the things we have to do is to understand that, as my colleague Ryan Anderson likes to talk about, religious liberty is not enough necessarily. It shouldn't be a fallback option. It gives us the argument to make powerful arguments in the public square that we should say, if you disagree with us, show us why we are wrong. And I've been making these arguments, I've been engaging these debates for over a decade, and I'm still convinced on the merits of what I believe. The question is, for those who disagree with me, are you going to banish me, or are you simply going to say, you're wrong, but we will find a way to coexist?
The book is Liberty for All, Defending Everyone's Religious Freedom in a Pluralistic Age, and will be available for purchase from the 4th of May this year. Professor Walker, thank you very much indeed for being with me today on Talking Freely.
Thank you.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.